John Peterson was born in Racine, Wisconsin in 1897.
And he bought 350 acres here in Boca Raton.
I think he always loved animals, so he came up with this idea of having a cageless zoo.
And he said, we're going to call it Africa USA.
After the government tried to close Africa USA, he was angry, but also he felt defeated. This was his dream.
Located on the southeast coast of Florida, between Fort Lauderdale and Palm Beach, Boca Raton is a city of quality and charm. The many resources and conveniences that this area had to offer made it apparent that it would be an excellent environment not just for a resort, but for a year-round home, a place where families, businesses, schools, and churches would thrive. Boca Raton, the Golden City on Florida's Gold Coast.
John Peterson was my father.
John Peterson was my grandfather. He was born in Racine, Wisconsin in 1897.
And he came from a family of 11 people. His parents came over from Denmark and couldn't speak English. And when he was in the 6th grade, he had to quit school in order to help support the family. He married and had 2 children, and he worked in a rubber factory. And then finally, he designed a tie-back. It was 3 flowers on a band, and he did them in all colors, and he finally had 35 women working for him in his cellar. So that's how he started getting his money.
My grandfather was really a Renaissance man. He was an inventor, he was creative, he was artistic, he was scientific. He read a lot about science, he read a lot about the earth, he knew a lot about animals. For many years, he tried to invent 3D films in which you didn't have to wear glasses.
He built houses in Wisconsin, and he came down here during the Depression, and he began to see all the property that was for sale for taxes that he could go to the courthouse and buy.
And he always had ideas, he always had schemes. He wanted to build a mountain in the middle of Florida, and the mountain would be almost like the mountain you see in the middle of Disneyland. And he would build houses all around the mountain. In Racine, Wisconsin, where he lived, he came up with a scheme. Buy one house, get a second house for a penny. And people came and bought houses, then bought a second house for a penny.
My brother and my mother found the land up here in Boca Raton, and he bought 350 acres for $25 an acre.
And Boca was very small. Actually, the population, I think, was about 1,000.
It was right off the main highway at that time. There was no, of course, I-95 nor Turnpike.
And he said, that's where I'm going to put that place. We're going to call it Africa USA.
I think he always loved animals, and because of that, and circus animals a lot of times had African animals, so he in a way wanted to have some sort of amusement park that wasn't a zoo where animals were in cages, but was more like a circus where you would actually be interacting with the animals. So he came up with this idea of having a cageless zoo where you could interact with the animals in a safe way by riding through them and pretending essentially that you were riding in a car in Africa. My father, Jack Peterson, went to Africa in 1951. He made contacts through the embassy, and it took him several months to even get to the people that he needed to speak to buy animals. How they were able to permit to get the animals here, I'm not really sure. I'm sure it was a lot of, my dad was a good talker, a negotiator, so I'm sure it was a lot of making the right contacts and getting the right signatures on the right papers. That's something that would not happen and could not happen today, and maybe should not happen today, but it could happen at that time.
He got herds of zebras. There are 3 kinds of zebras. He got elands. The natives use them for meat. The little gazelles that jump, wildebeests, camels, and he had the only Z-horse in the world. And the Z-horse mother was a Arabian racehorse. And the horse got the color of its mother, the reddish color, and it got the stripes of its father, which was a gravy zebra. And a gravy zebra is bigger than the other ones. It's almost the size of a horse, has big banjo ears, has a mane that goes from his neck all the way to his tail. He's a beautiful, beautiful animal.
They actually built crates for the animals on trucks, trucked them all down to the port in Mombasa in Kenya, where they were loaded upon a ship called the African Planet.
And while my brother was in Africa capturing the animals, my mother and father planted plants, 10,000 of them, in this garden area with the waterfalls and the lake. And Dad wanted it to be free. So if they can't afford to go in, at least they can see the gardens, the waterfalls, the geysers, Monkey Island, the chickens walking around and peacocks and that.
On board, the ostrich would grow so fast that they actually had to rebuild some of their cages as the trip took several weeks to get across the Atlantic Ocean.
And it was a fairly arduous journey on the boat. Some rough seas, and the animals would get sick, and they had to stay in these very tight wooden containers for the entire voyage.
All the way around the Cape of Good Horn to get here to Port Everglades, where the animals arrived in 1952.
We all went down to see my uncle on this day, and the press was there, and all the photographers were there, and all these African animals coming.
Admission to the park was $1.25 for the tram ride. So it was about an hour-and-a-half tour. It had one stop on its way, which was the African village, where they also sold trinkets and things to the tourists. You could then take an electric boat ride through the lagoon, which would give you a close-up view of the geyser or the waterfall, both of which were artificially created.
There was a restaurant for some time in there and a snack bar. There was a photo stand where you could buy cameras and film. There was a diamond exhibit where you could go through this diamond exhibit and see not real diamonds, but fake diamonds of famous diamonds, like the Hope Diamond and that sort of thing.
Most of the time, we just went because the gardens were free, which was such a gift, because it was a botanical garden with the waterfall and the geyser and so much vegetation, big trees, flowering trees. We like to just go visit the gardens and walk around.
I'd bring my friends there all the time. I was in the Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts. Hey, you guys want to go on an African safari? Sure. I was popular. When we did show and tell at school, I had some stories to tell, and I had some things to share, because I'd bring in a Machaca's shield and talk about the zebra that almost trampled me, or the ostrich that I helped hatch. I had stories that the normal kids, regular kids, could never tell.
The thing I loved to do was go around with people with the cheetahs and parades and movie premieres and walking on the beach with them and seeing people's faces when you take them for a ride in the car. They look and then they look again, you know, like they can't believe it.
My father purchased authentic African costumes while he was there, with the masks and skins and drums. Locals would dress up and actually put on a little bit of show for the tourists. One of the African American workers would always play what they called machacas, who would have his spear, and he would kind of angrily greet the visitors as they went through the main gates, speaking a foreign tongue. Probably the most well-known animal they had there was called Princess Margaret, and she was a trained chimpanzee who my grandfather had trained. She wore the clothing of a little girl. She could ride a tricycle.
Margaret was a very special chimpanzee. She was raised as a member of the family. She lived, for the most part, in the house. She had her own room. However, it was like a playpen, like a baby would go in. When I came to stay with my grandparents, which was all summer long, and during the weekends, we'd share a room. So Margaret was my furry sister.
They dressed her in organdy dresses and little white shoes and a big bow in her hair, and they raised her like a human being. They'd go into a restaurant, sit her in a high chair, and she would sit there and eat. Mother trained her to go to the bathroom by herself, wipe herself, flush the toilet, and then wash her hands, and then show my mother her hands were washed. And a lot of people don't realize that chimpanzees don't have bugs or fleas. They're a lot like us, but they're hairier.
And I really, just on Sunday, love to go through, just to take the train ride all the way out to the jungle where the chimpanzees were. And they had a booth there, and I wore a hat and played with the chimps, just the baby ones. And it was I sold the tickets to the show. They put on a wonderful show.
The park was very close to the Boca Raton Club, which attracted a lot of high-end clientele. My grandfather would bring over Margaret or some of the other tame animals to entertain the guests.
And there was one man that really, truly loved her and wanted to buy her, but Dad wouldn't sell her. And that was from Anheuser and Busch, Gussie Busch. And when he'd go over to his suite at the Boca Raton Hotel, he'd call up and say, "Would you please send little Margaret over for me?" And Mother would get her all dressed up in her organdy dress and the big bow in her hair and take her over. And the minute she saw the suite door, little Margaret, she would jump up and down, and she'd be so excited because she knew who was in there. And when they opened the door, she ran with her arms outstretched to him, and he picked her up, and he hugged her and hugged her. He let her play with his expensive wristwatch, and then they'd have ice cream and cookies before she'd go home. They'd sit at the table, and he'd say, "I just love her so much."
Also popular were the two cheetahs, Moja and Mimbili, which means 1 and 2 in Swahili. They were completely tame. You could pet them. They would purr just like house cats.
He'd let the kids come up to him, and the cheetah would lick their hand, and they'd be amazed because it was just like sandpaper, very rough.
The park was a big draw. It was a very successful enterprise for my grandfather.
Africa USA was one of the actually larger and more successful tourist attractions here in Boca Raton in the 1950s and 60s.
The admissions that they got provided a steady income. I would say on a good winter day, probably upwards of 2,000 people a day went through the park.
It was post-war era. A lot of new residents and tourists were coming here. Many of them were veterans returning to Florida, having served here during World War II. And also things like the air conditioning and pest control made South Florida a much more pleasant place to visit for many tourists.
He was famous for his billboards. He had just dozens of billboards up and down US 1, actually all the way down.
In the 1950s, you're primarily marketing to people on their way further south, headed towards Miami principally. These would be people traveling by car.
I think his attraction was very typical of the type of Florida attraction that existed at that time, the roadside attractions, not the mega attractions like we would see today with Universal Studios or Disney World.
Everything from alligator farms, Alligator Joe's in Palm Beach of all places.
In Pompano Beach there was one called Storyland,
which was sort of a reconstruction of a fairy tale world that all children and no parents wanted to go to.
There was Gatorland,
Pioneer City,
Theater of the Sea down in the Keys. These are smaller scale attractions that, maybe take you 2 or 3 hours to go to. They weren't day-long events. There was a lot of TV productions that were done on site. A lot of commercials were shot there.
Celebrities came and went all the time. And every once in a while, Johnny, you gotta come. Lloyd Bridges. Lloyd Bridges? Who's Lloyd Bridges? Mike Nelson from Sea Hunt is here. So I'd run down the hill and I'd meet Lloyd Bridges. I remember we'd have all sorts of celebrities for dinner all the time. We had Jack Parr was a good friend of my grandfather.
He did some interviews and did a lot of on-site work there at Africa USA, many times with Margaret the trained chimp on his TV show, which was the first version of The Tonight Show on NBC. The most famous photo shoot to ever occur at Africa USA was the one that kind of launched Betty Page's career. Betty Page was a a kind of a pinup star of the 1950s, and she teamed up with Bunny Yeager to take her jungle shots that were all done there at Africa USA with the two cheetahs. For the August 1st, 1960 issue of Life magazine, Africa USA was on the cover and beat out this other park in California called Disneyland. They had purchased a giraffe and were bringing it in, having it shipped in from Africa, and the Department of Agriculture impounded it, saying that a private person could not own a giraffe. And it was a court case that went one step short of the Supreme Court. It got all the way to the top District Court of Appeals in Washington. And my father assisted the attorney there in Washington, D.C., and they won the case. They nicknamed the giraffe Moneybags because it had been a very expensive court battle.
And so, my grandfather then got a bill after he won the lawsuit to get the giraffe. The government said, oh, no, you can't have the giraffe until you pay the feed bill, which was $2,400 or something like that. So they went back to court and they said, no, we're not paying this feed bill. And he won again. He won.
And I always say it's an example of winning battles and losing wars, because it wasn't that long afterward that some Department of Agriculture agents had showed up unannounced.
And in the family, we always thought it was a government conspiracy, that Lyndon Johnson and his cronies decided to shut down Africa USA once and for all because Africa USA and John P. Peterson and Jack Peterson had made the government look stupid.
Both the federal government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and various state organizations had previous experience with tick vector diseases causing massive losses in both horses and cattle. Those were from ticks, the so-called cattle ticks that were here in the United States already. They were indigenous. So they were always on the lookout for new ticks and new opportunities to spread disease. They began to look at the park because it had exotic animals in it, and the suspicion was it might have exotic ticks as a result of the exotic animals, and indeed they found some. And so there was great fear that these animals in the Africa USA park could be the host for the spread of new disease to both horses and cattle in the United States. They were very concerned about that.
And they had come, did an inspection of the park grounds, and they came back with a folded handkerchief in which contained some dead ticks. And they showed it to my grandfather, and they said, we found these rare African red ticks on your animals. We're shutting you down right now.
And he said, we have to spray all your animals. My dad said, I've never seen any red tick. He said, my veterinarian has never seen red tick. And they said, well, we have, and we're going to spray them.
So he immediately went to see his veterinarian, and with this story, and the veterinarian looked at the animals, didn't find any ticks, took blood samples to find any evidence of this fever, this tick fever, sent the blood samples in, everything came back fine. So my grandfather said, I don't know what they're trying to pull here. And the vet said, there's nothing wrong with your animals and there are no ticks. So he gave that news to my grandfather. The veterinarian, who has since passed away, told me not too long ago, maybe 5-6 years ago before he passed away, he said, I've never told anyone his story. He said, but when I got to my surgery at 6 a.m. the next morning, he said the agents were waiting for me and they told me, if you pursue this, you're a dead man. So he told my grandfather, we better stop right now. These people mean business.
That was too much. He knew he was lucky. He knew that he won the case and it was all good and all that, but he knew that the government was out to get him now.
They sprayed lots of DDT on the animals and on the property.
And a good many of them died.
There was a rather massive plan in terms of high dosage and frequency of spraying DDT, both on the animals and in the surrounding area of the park, in an effort to eradicate the ticks that they saw. Some animals died. Then there was controversy over what caused the death of the animals. Was it the DDT or was it something else? Well, unfortunately, we'll probably never know, because the kinds of analyses it would take to answer that question, that is tissue samples and gut contents, were never taken.
And it was just one of the many things. My grandfather by this time was 65 years old. There had been neighborhoods sprouting up around Africa USA. People were complaining about the traffic, the noise from the animals at night, fear that they would escape.
It was getting so famous that it couldn't be this little hometown park-like zoo anymore. It was becoming a big responsibility. That created a lot of sleepless nights.
They actually lived on the property, but still you didn't know what was going to happen, and he always had a nightmare that all the animals would get out because somebody would let them out by cutting the fences.
Worrying about kids breaking in and getting killed, worrying about me getting kidnapped, worrying about his money being stolen at the point of a gun, worried about all of these things that potentially could happen as a result of having a place like Africa USA.
I have since talked to people that routinely told me they cut through the fences and ran with the animals at night, which I'm sure if my grandfather knew, he would be very upset. So life was beginning to encroach upon the park, and when it was built, it was in the middle of nowhere, but as land became too valuable, more and more, it kind of encroached on the park and became too close with housing and other things.
And so he decided to close up shop and get out.
The land became too valuable at that point to have just as an attraction. So he had several offers on the property and then eventually accepted one from Alexander and Powell, who wanted the property to put in a huge development that they were to name Camino Gardens.
After the government tried to close Africa USA through this red tick scare, and my grandfather sold Africa USA, he was angry, but also he felt defeated. This was his dream, you know? And all he had now, which was something, was being a millionaire. He could be a millionaire. He didn't have chimpanzees, and he had the experience of having Africa USA. He was a beaten man.
I think it was very hard for him to sell, although one part of him was relieved of not having to worry.
And he kept dreaming. He kept dreaming of other things he wanted to do, but he was getting old too. He wasn't doing as much. He wanted to go to Australia and live. He did. He went to Australia. He lived in Australia. And then he got disillusioned in Australia because the government was coming after people for taxes, and he had a lot of money. He thought he'd lose a lot of his money over there, so he came back to the United States.
Ended up living in Lake Worth. He bought 20 acres there and built a home, built another waterfall that never quite worked right, but he always wanted to recreate a little piece of that.
And started fiddling around with trying to invent a perpetual motion machine. And thinking about what is the Federal Reserve doing to our economy. He would write treatises about the Federal Reserve.
My grandfather died at the age of 99 in 1998, so he got to be a very elderly man.
He was a wonderful grandfather. He was loving. He was loving to my cousin and to me and to the rest of the family.
It's funny, when I was growing up, I would always hear this Africa USA, and I mean, you kind of knew what it was as a kid, but I was always fascinated by it and wished so much that I could have seen it, but it all happened before I was born. To preserve the memory, in 2001, I started a website because I had all the things. My grandfather had passed away in 1998, so I had been given all of the films and the photographs and some of the postcards. So I scanned a lot of them, and I wanted to create kind of a memory site for people to enjoy. If they remembered going there as a child, they could, look it up on the internet and see some photographs and some footage of what the park was like.
And I tell everybody about it because it's history. It's not only Florida's history, it's American history, because it was the first one in the nation.
Maybe once or twice a year, I will get an email where someone is rather upset and says, when is your park open? What are the open? You don't have anywhere posted on your website what hours you're open and what's your admission. So I'll say, well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is admission is $1.25, but the bad news is the park closed in 1961. So it's always, and they always find that rather humorous, like, oh, you know, because they get all excited, like, wow, I never heard of this place in Boca Raton. Where is it? So, and how much is it? So it's kind of humorous.